All right, in today's video and probably the next 2 or 3 videos, we're discussing a key concepts that you need to know for your real estate licensing exam. It's called agency relationships. In today's video, specifically, we're going to discuss, as part of those agency relationships, who the parties to a real estate transaction are and the fiduciary duties that each party owes each other. So we have to understand this concept because in the next couple of videos, we're actually going to talk about the different types of agency relationships and who are a part of those relationships and so forth. But we got to start today with identifying who is who. So here are the common parties involved in a transaction. The first one is what we call the agent, which is a real estate agent, or sometimes called a licensee with 2 E's, a licensee. An agent, a real estate agent, or a licensee, they are the exact same person. The only thing is you have to know as a student is your licensing exam can use these 2 terms interchangeably, but they're the same person. And it simply means that they have a real estate license. That's it. Whether it's a broker's, a salesperson's, or whatever your state has, they are licensed. They're a licensed real estate professional. Now, the agent is kind of the core of the transaction. From the agent, they're going to work with buyers, sellers, they're going to work with tenants, owners, vendors, vendees, those type of things. But the agent is going to owe, or the licensee is going to owe, what's called fiduciary duties. Fiduciary duties, or sometimes called fiduciary obligations to their client. And I kind of like to preface this by using the example of the attorney-client. The attorney is the licensed attorney in that state, and they are representing their client, right? So, the agent owes fiduciary duties to their client, or sometimes called a principal. Now, once again, client, principal, they are the same person. All right, you have to know that for your exam. So the agent represents the client, and they owe the client certain fiduciary duties. All right, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but I like repetition to drive home the concept here. The agent owes fiduciary duties to their client or principal. Client or principal that's the party that the agent represents. Now, what are those fiduciary duties that agent owes to the client? Well, there's 6 of them specifically that I want to talk about. And the first one is called loyalty. Loyalty simply means that the agent is going to put the client's interest first. They're going to put the client's interest above their own or somebody else's. So loyalty is number 1. They're going to remain loyal in that transaction to that client. Number 2, the second fiduciary duty is obedience. Now, obedience means that the agent is going to carry out the wishes, the lawful wishes and requests of their client. So if the client wants them to write up an extremely lowball offer on a listing, well, if the agent is representing a buyer client and the buyer client says, I want to offer $25,000 on a home that's for sale at a price of $250,000, then they have an obligation under the obedience provision of fiduciary duties to write that offer. Number 3, disclosure. That is the third fiduciary duty. Not only does the licensee or the agent have the requirement to disclose to everyone involved in the transaction of who the agent represents, but it also falls under, they have to disclose anything that's required by law. So maybe there is a adverse material fact about the property. Maybe there's hidden termite damage that's been discovered. There would be an obligation to disclose that to their client. And in fact, there would be an obligation to disclose that to non-clients as well. But one of the fiduciary duties is disclosure. Number 4, skill. As a highly trained, licensed real estate professional, you have a set of skills that the average person doesn't. and you're required to use that skill to represent the best interest of your client. All right? Now remember, client or principal mean the same thing, and a client or principal can be anyone in the transaction. So your client might be a buyer, a seller, a landlord, a tenant, a vendor. It's all of those. All right? Just depends on what capacity you're representing that client. Number 5, confidentiality. You have to keep things confidential. What's an example of confidential information that you as the agent might have to keep secret? I'll give you an example. Let's say that the seller, you're the agent and you represent a seller as a client. And the reason the seller is moving is they're getting a divorce. That is a piece of information that a buyer might want to know, because that's going to definitely impact that initial offer, because the buyer's going to say, hey, the seller's in a desperate situation. We might as well try to lowball the offer and see what happens. So that can have an impact on the outcome of the transaction. So that would be considered confidential information. Now, the agent cannot disclose confidential information whatsoever, legitimate, lawful confidential information. However, if the seller wants that information to be provided to anybody, then with permission of the client, you can release that confidential information. There have been times when I personally listed homes where the sellers were getting a divorce, and that's the reason they're selling. And to spark some interest, they decided to disclose that it's a divorce situation, so please submit your offer. And then they decided to deal with any lowball offers through the negotiation process. But as an agent, a licensee, I could not disclose that information until I had permission of my client to do so. Now, this confidential information, as I said, has to be, number one, has to be lawful. So if there's something that is required to be disclosed, so for example, let's say that a buyer, I represent the buyer, I'm an agent, and I discover that the buyer is having a hard time getting final approval for the loan, that's germane to the transaction. So I do have to disclose that to the listing agent, even though the seller is not my client, because it's not considered confidential information. We'll talk about those type of scenarios in a different video, a little bit more detailed. The other thing to know about confidentiality, it's perpetual. Even after the transaction is closed or been terminated, if there's confidential things that I know about my client, I can never disclose that without their permission. Number 6, and the last one here, is accounting. I have to account for any monies or anything like that or sensitive information even that comes into my possession. So things like earnest money, security deposits, rent money, those type of things. I'd have to adhere to state law and processes and account for all that money in a lawful way. So those are the fiduciary duties that I owe my client or principal in a real estate transaction. And there are. All right, the next party I want to talk about is what we call a customer, or sometimes called an unrepresented person. In fact, I've even seen some of the licensing exams call them a third party. Again, this can be like the client or principal. This can be a buyer, a seller, an owner, a tenant, a vendor. It doesn't matter. It just means that I, the licensee or agent, I'm working with a customer. That means they are not represented, meaning I don't owe them the fiduciary duties that I owe a client, but I still owe them certain duties. All right, and I'll give you an example where this is probably the most common. Let's say that I'm the listing agent and I have the seller's house up for sale. The seller is my client. And this person walks through my open house and says, hey, Paul, I want to write up an offer. Can you do it? And I say, sure. But guess what? I have to disclose I represent the seller, so I'm going to be working with you as a customer. Now, what does that mean? Well, I owe you some certain duties. I owe the client, my seller client, these fiduciary duties. But here's the duties I owe you. All right. Number 1 is I have to disclose. Disclosure. I'm going to disclose to the customer here that I represent the seller and the seller is my client. That's the first thing. Number 2, All right, number 2, I want to get it right here. No misrepresentation. No misrepresentation. I cannot misrepresent any fact about that property, all right, in a way that was going to bolster my client's position. I have to be truthful. I either have to be truthful about the facts, or if it falls under a confidential situation, I have to say I can't disclose it because it's confidential information. So I have to be truthful in, if they ask about the age of the roof, or when the home was built, or are there covenants, or things like that. Number 3, the next duty that I owe a customer is present all offers. I have to present all offers, and I have to do so in a timely manner. So the person that's coming through my open house, they want to write up an offer. Well, I'm going to write it up, and then I'm going to present it in a timely manner to my client, who is, in our scenario here, the seller. Number 4, provide good service. Good customer service. I have an obligation to do that. Honest, good customer service. And the last one is provide information. I have a duty to provide information not only about the house, or things that are relevant to the transaction that aren't confidential information about my client. And where we might see this is information, so for example, again, about the house, how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, how many garage bays are there, information about covenants and so forth. But also, let's say that the buyer that came through the open house, they don't have a lender, and they say, hey, Paul, a couple of good lenders you could refer me to, or, I need some information on a home warranty. Those are all things that I can provide a customer. It's not a fiduciary duty, it's just part of that good service. And the last party I want to talk about here is called a transactional broker. Transactional broker. And the reason I bring it up is because many students as of late has been saying that this has been on their licensing exam. So what is a transactional broker? Well, it involves an agent or a licensee, and typically where we would see this is a seller is selling their home for sale by owner. They have found their own buyer, and they come to you as the licensee and say, hey, can you put the paperwork together and get this thing closed? And you say, great, that's what I'm going to do for X amount of dollars, and the seller agrees. That's the most common. And a transactional broker simply means that you're doing the deal and all parties are customers. So we have customer on customer. So the buyer in our scenario, the buyer and the seller are both customers. That is the relationship between the licensee and the buyer and the seller. That means the agent does not owe any fiduciary duties to either one of these, but they do owe these 5 duties to each one of them. So they're basically just brokering the transaction. Real quickly, remember, in most states, transactional brokerage is illegal, including here in Nebraska where I am. Typically, in most states, the agent has to represent at least one of the parties as a client, and then they can treat the other one as a customer. But in states that allow it, this is where they're just transactional and both parties are customers.